On February 15th, The Hollywood Reporter ran the story that Star Trek IV, the fourth movie of the Kelvin Timeline continuity, is back on, and that it'll bring back Chris Pine's Captain Kirk and the rest of his crew, including Zachary Quinto, Zoe Saldana, John Cho, Simon Pegg, and Karl Urban, and shoot later this year for a 2023 release. 1 week later, on February 22nd, The Hollywood Reporter also ran the story that the agents of Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto, John Cho, Simon Pegg, and Karl Urban had never even heard about this, let alone received any offers, to say nothing of actually signing on. For Star Trek IV, however, this kind of embarrassing back and forth is nothing new. If anything, it's par for the course. In this video, we'll look back at Star Trek IV's sordid history of development and premature announcements, why it hasn't been made so far, and if it really might happen this time. Prior to making the third Star Trek movie of the Kelvin Timeline, the studio had to renegotiate with its principal cast. Since it had been 7 years since the original deals were made, a requirement of California law. At the time of this renegotiation, the second movie, Star Trek Into Darkness, had only marginally underperformed relative to the first, so the cast were given a great deal for the third movie, and an even better option for a possible fourth movie after that. Chris Pine, in particular, got a great deal, reportedly getting $6 million up front for Star Trek Beyond, plus a back end, a substantial increase from the $600,000 he got for the first film, and the $1.5 million he got for the second. There's no word on what he was promised in the option for a fourth movie, but it was more than the $6 million plus back end he got for the third. What they hadn't taken on board, though, was that Into Darkness's comparatively strong box office was a result of the, all in all, positive reception to the first movie. The box office for Star Trek Beyond, however, was a referendum on Into Darkness. As a result, Star Trek Beyond bombed, and by the time all was said and done, it would lose its investors in the vicinity of $100 million. Although they didn't necessarily know how badly Star Trek Beyond would tank in the end, even prior to its release, the powers that be at Paramount and production company Bad Robot had access to early tracking numbers and knew that even in the best case scenario, Beyond would underperform. In order to preemptively counter their investors and funding partners getting cold feet following the news cycle that was sure to follow, they put together an offering tailored to secure further funding for more movies. In addition to the regular cast, the next movie, penned by J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay of future Amazon's Lord of the Rings of Power infamy, would bring back Kirk's dad, played by pre-famed Chris Hemsworth in the 2009 movie. Since then, however, he had become Marvel's Thor. Getting him back into the fold now would be a huge selling point, not necessarily to the audience, but to investors and funding partners. The implied sale pitch was, Beyond might not have worked out as we hoped, but the next one has Thor, so you don't want to miss out on that. Time was of the essence, as Paramount and Bad Robot wanted a Star Trek IV announcement out and making waves before the release of Star Trek Beyond. The supporting casts were assumed to fall in line later, so the priority was to secure the participation of Chris Pine, Chris Hemsworth, and Zachary Quinto, and secure it fast. Hence, Star Trek IV was announced on July 21st of 2016, the day before the release of Star Trek Beyond. The press release stated that, in the next installment of the epic space adventure, Chris Pine's Captain Kirk will cross paths with a man he'd never had a chance to meet, but whose legacy has haunted him since the day he was born, his father. The day after, Star Trek Beyond opened to middling numbers. It would soon become clear that the movie was underperforming worse than anyone thought possible. No matter how investor-friendly the Star Trek IV pitch might have been, Star Trek IV ended up in limbo for the next 2 years, unable to secure funding. Securing funding wasn't a problem for just Star Trek, but for Paramount at large. A series of poor greenlighting decisions led to most of their high-profile movies bombing, and to the studio accruing more than $10 billion in debt. Chinese investors losing so much on Paramount movies actually contributed to Beijing altering their financial legislation to making investing in American movies more difficult, which in turn saw Paramount lose their access to Chinese capital. In February of 2018, at the quarterly conference call, Viacom Chief Financial Officer Wade Davis addressed a new strategy which was aimed at turning Paramount Pictures around under a new management. This strategy can be summarized as make more movies with audience appeal on smaller budgets. Since Paramount only had so many franchises with audience appeal, this strategy gave Star Trek on film a new lease on life. But the massive blockbuster budgets of the earlier Kelvin Timeline movies were off the table. According to information we received at the time, Paramount, Skydance, and Bad Robot were able to scrape together a total budget in the vicinity of $80 million from other undisclosed funding partners that had not been burned by Star Trek Beyond or other Paramount failures. The offering made to them was a Star Trek IV guest starring Chris Hemsworth, and another selling point was added in the form of woke brownie points and director S.J. Clarkson. The perhaps biggest selling point from an investor point of view, though, was much reduced risk in the form of a much reduced budget. But in order to change Star Trek IV from the high-end, four-quadrant blockbuster it originally had been conceived as into the medium-budget production it now has to become, cast salaries had to be cut accordingly. There was, however, one problem, and it was an expensive one. The agreements Bad Robot, Skydance, and Paramount had signed with Pegg and Quinto back in 2015 all assumed Star Trek IV would still get the massive blockbuster treatment, even more so than Beyond, and that was no longer the case. Instead, they had to renege on the prior agreements and ask the stars to take payment cuts, which reflected the budget now available. This was when Chris Hemsworth and Chris Pine walked. Although not widely reported, we've been told by insiders with knowledge of the situation that other key cast members dropped out as well. This led to the investors that were getting cold feet and withdrawing their support, despite the best efforts of the involved, and some making arguments that Star Trek didn't really need Chris Pine's Kirk. No further funding could be found to make up for this, and Star Trek IV ended up scrapped for the time being. On the plus side, this allowed director S.J. Clarkson to accept the offer from HBO to develop and shoot the $30 million pilot for the Game of Thrones prequel, Blood Moon, the full series of which you will never see, because it was cancelled for reasons that can best be summarized as the pilot was too woke. Hiring S.J. Clarkson didn't really work out too well for HBO, but as long as someone else pays for it, the Star Trek business is a profitable one for Bad Robot, so they were soon back with another version of Star Trek IV. On November 19th of 2019, Variety reported that Star Trek IV was back on, this time from writer and director Noah Hawley. His movie would no longer feature Chris Hemsworth and the storyline of Kirk's dad being brought back to life, but it was planned to feature Pine and his crew. It should be stressed, however, that this was not a formal announcement, but a strategic leak aimed at investors and financiers rather than the movie going public. Perhaps hoping to push investors towards making the right decision, The Hollywood Reporter also put out a strategically timed article, which highlighted that despite earlier missteps, the fans were still there for Star Trek, and at the right level of cost, a Star Trek movie could still be a very financially lucrative venture. It didn't help. Investors weren't convinced, and since the necessary funding couldn't be found, the project died again a few months later. Noah Hawley went on to becoming showrunner for Disney's upcoming Alien series, which will focus more on the development of AI and synths rather than the actual alien. In March 4th of 2021, Deadline Hollywood reported that Kalinda Vasquez, one of the writers on Star Trek Discovery, had been tapped to write a Star Trek movie for J.J. Abrams' production company Bad Robot. Though they would soon forget all about it, the publication made a point of her name sounding almost like that of a Star Trek character. Star Trek IV was announced by Deadline Hollywood again a few months later, this time in July of 2021. It was now reported that WandaVision director Matt Shankman would helm the movie, which was set to be written by Lindsay Beer and Geneva Robertson-Dorette. Having forgotten all about Kalinda Vasquez, the publication placed extra emphasis on this being the first time a Star Trek feature film would be written exclusively by female writers. That wouldn't last, though. This brings us back to where we started the most recent iteration of Star Trek IV, the one for all intents and purposes announced by The Hollywood Reporter on February 15th of 2022. According to the publication, this version of the movie is still set to be directed by WandaVision director Matt Shankman, but now Josh Friedman and Cameron Squires will write the script, though their script is based on the earlier draft by Lindsay Beer and Geneva Robertson-Dorette. This script assumes the participation of Chris Pine as his crew, but as we saw from the follow-up scoop from 1 week later, the cast representatives haven't heard anything about this. So, what's going on? The February 15th announcement was made by J.J. Abrams himself, alongside Paramount executive Brian Robbins, on Paramount's Investor Day. Like before, the target audience for this message weren't the fans or the audience, but potential investors. Investors who need to open up their wallets if the movie actually is going to end up getting made, let alone in time for the projected December 2023 release date. The reason the cast representatives haven't heard anything about it at this time is that Bad Robot and Paramount had yet to scrape together the necessary funds to actually make the movie and make the necessary offers. In other words, the future of Star Trek on the big screen still depends on them being able to scrape together the required funding to see it through. Do you think it'll happen this time? Let us know in the comments, and we'll keep you up to date as we learn more.